Hi, everyone. Welcome. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Hopefully, it's absurdly early or absurdly late for you. We are recording this webinar, so we'll be sharing it afterwards. Welcome to the first in our series of RFP webinars geared specifically to developers. This webinar will be focused on mangroves. Thank you so much for the questions that you shared with us ahead of time. We're going to try to answer those as much as we can in the presentation, and then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. If we don't answer a specific question on your mind, please do email us afterwards. We'll be trying to be as responsive as possible to questions. My name is Julia Strong. I'm the Executive Director of Symbiosis Coalition, joined today from the Symbiosis team by Paulo Quadri, our technical lead, and Ellie Rakoff, our technical fellow. We will also have Silvestrum Climate Associates with us on the call. We're delighted to have them. They'll introduce themselves later on. So for today's call, we're going to first give us a little bit of background on symbiosis and why mangroves, for those of you who are newer to symbiosis and to the work that we're doing. We'll talk about our quality criteria and our approach to quality and how we think about project selection. We'll do an RFP overview. Then Silvestrum will walk through some of the key components when we think about mangrove projects and how we consider mangrove projects, and we'll end with a Q&A. So to start off, Symbiosis is a coalition of buyers dedicated to growing the supply of high-integrity nature-based carbon removal projects that the world needs to meet its climate goals. We know that without a clear demand signal for high-integrity nature-based carbon removal, followed by long-term offtake agreements, we can't scale and unlock the billions of dollars needed to get the scale of nature-based carbon removals that the world needs. So we do 4 things to advance our mission. One is an action-oriented offtake commitment, that demand signal to give the investors and developers the certainty they need to develop these high-integrity projects. Second is to clarify what good looks like through a unified quality criteria informed by experts and scientists and building on best-in-class standards that reflect the most rigorous and current science. Third, we want to make it as easy as possible for developers and buyers to engage in the market and to sign these long-term offtake agreements. So we try to translate our offtake commitment demand signal into actual signed offtake agreements through our joint RFP. And finally, market development. Our goal is to share what we're learning more broadly, to lay a blueprint that other buyers can follow, and to empower more buyers, more developers, more investors to act and to support this market and these projects. Our RFP, we launched our first RFP in Q4 of 2024, focused on reforestation and agroforestry projects. We've announced 2 projects from that RFP to date. We'll be announcing more projects this year. We just launched a couple of weeks ago our second RFP, also focused on reforestation and agroforestry, but adding mangroves, very exciting. And we will consider other project types over time. So this webinar is really focused on mangroves and helping mangrove developers prepare for this RFP. So why mangroves? Symbiosis is dedicated to catalyzing the next generation of nature-based carbon removal projects that can help the world meet its climate goals. We know that mangroves have a large climate potential. They store 10 times more carbon per unit than terrestrial forests and can sequester carbon 2 to 5 times faster per hectare. They provide significant other benefits to society, to communities, including climate resilience, adaptation, by helping to protect communities from storm surge. They help with food security. They're the nurseries for fisheries around the world. Billions of fish rely on mangroves. They help advance livelihoods. Local livelihoods depend on mangroves and also support tourism, among other benefits. It's a maturing rapidly sector, but it's still nascent, and a demand signal that's followed with real offtakes from Symbiosis Coalition can help to be catalytic for growing the overall sector and helping these projects scale. So in terms of our approach to quality, we are focused on sending a demand signal for projects that can drive real climate impact with benefits to people and nature as well. And so we aim to create a positive feedback loop to build the market for and scale high integrity projects. First, we look at the latest science, data, best practice, latest standards to inform our definition of quality. That helps to define, and we use that to set quality pillars and quality criteria that I'll go into shortly. We use that to define this project type specific quality criteria. Then we use that to inform our selection of projects and to evaluate projects, which then are inform lessons learned from those projects, what's working and what's not, which then we hope goes back into informing updated science and data and best practice to create a positive feedback loop for high integrity projects. Um, where our tech quality criteria is informed by and shaped by our technical advisory board of leading scientists and experts from organizations like the Nature Conservancy, Yale, MIT, University of Cambridge, Johns Hopkins University, a diverse experts that represent different disciplines that we know are critical for advancing high integrity nature-based carbon removal projects, from carbon accounting and climate science to economics, and to best practices for governance and local stakeholder engagement. Our quality criteria, our quality pillars that you can find on our website, and we may be dropping some links in the chat as we go, define our definition of high integrity projects. We aim to build on existing standards to help to contribute to consistent standards in the market. So we point to the ICVCM's core carbon principles, but clarify that when we define quality, we're looking at projects that reflect conservative approaches to carbon accounting that are durable and lasting. And if in the event that there are reversals, that we account for and compensate for those reversals. We look for projects where social and community benefits are given equitably to the community, where engaging communities from design all the way through implementation is not a co-benefit, but actually a core driver of durability and of the project's success. We look for projects that advance ecological integrity and also transparency, where third parties can understand and evaluate what's working and what's not. Our quality criteria drill down one level deeper to help to give actionable guidance for project developers, but that stay high level enough to be durable and apply across geographies. And also, with our latest release of our quality criteria in February, apply across ecosystem types. So we call out where there are nuances for specific project types, for specific project pathways, but we want to really show that some of the tenets, there are common principles that apply regardless of the ecosystem type when it comes to nature-based carbon removal. And we aim to tie each criterion back to one or more of our 5 quality pillars, showing that these are often reinforcing criteria that touch upon multiple different pillars. So we expanded to our quality criteria to mangroves in February in 2026. This was informed by experts from our technical advisory board, but also from Yale, UC Berkeley, Terra Carbon, B0, Silvera, Calyx Global, Silvestrum, Conservation International, and the Nature Conservancy. Some of the highlights, as you well know on the call for the mangrove experts on the call, are that we built this on the high quality blue carbon principles and guidance that already lay out sort of best practices for mangrove projects in the market. We talked about the natural and assisted regeneration before direct planting, and Silvestrum will go more into this sort of hierarchy of restoration approaches. We talk about how to think about different measuring biomass versus soil organic carbon, allogenous carbon, et cetera. And we explicitly include how sea level rise risk considerations. When it comes to Symbiosis recommending which projects advance to each stage of diligence, a successful submission will go beyond just alignment with our quality criteria. We're looking at both the commercial proposal, so the price, the volume, alignment with our offtake guidance, and a number of developers asked about price and how we think about price. We do not have a target price of Symbiosis. We will assess each project to determine the competitiveness of the price volume, and seek transparency into the key drivers of project costs and pricing to evaluate alignment with our minimum quality criteria, adequacy of implementation resources, reversal risk mitigation, and the equitable sharing of benefits with local communities and landowners. And We also look at, in addition to commercial proposal and quality, the ability to execute. So, does the developer have the staff capacity, connection to local partners with the capacity and staff to execute on their plan? We look at the PDD, the implemented pilot, and the success of that pilot or the lessons learned from that pilot, and evidence that they could execute via the land pipeline. We also consider things like geography and policy contexts, other project risks, and the scalability and replicability of the approach. With that, I'll hand it over to our technical lead, Paulo Quadri, to walk through applying to the RFP and how to think about that. And 1 second, I will unspotlight myself and spotlight you, Paulo, so people see you. Here we go.
Thank you. Thank you. Love being in the spotlight. Thanks, Julia. Hi, everyone. Good morning for those over here on the West Coast. All right. Well, let's walk through our RFP overview first. As you probably know, so the RFP is for projects to provide 10-year or to engage in 10-year offtake agreements. Although this time we are piloting 4 mangrove projects, a pre-purchase track for up to 1 million tons. The process, as you can see here, in general, consists of these 6 stages. That once you reach the intermediate stage, we expect projects to be able to move to that stage around May, late May, more or less. That is a stage that is led by the Symbiosis team. And then by summer, we would expect the first group of projects to progress to full diligence, which is led by one of our diligence providers with the support and review of Symbiosis. Next. So what is different this time? We heard a lot of feedback. We learned a lot during the first year, so we have updated our process. And among some of these new updates, now we have a rolling deadline so that you can apply when you're best positioned to. So no stress, no rush there. We also have now reduced the upfront information burden and tightened our eligibility criteria to make things also less intense at the beginning there. We now have clear progress tracking via the available platform, which we hope that you will find seamless and smooth to navigate. And we have an accelerated process by considering previous diligence where appropriate. So if we already did some research on a particular project, then we can use that to speed things up a little bit. Next. So what about our eligibility criteria? Well, it is simple but crucial. You will not be able to advance to the screening stage of the RFP and complete the next sections if your submission doesn't meet these first requirements. We know that RFPs can be burdensome. The goal here is for developers, for you to be able to apply once you're ready, as we were mentioning. And so the key things here are that we have a project stage is very important, is the first thing to consider. We are looking into post-feasibility with a minimum of draft PDD and a pilot area implemented. We're also accepting different project types. So we have reforestation and agroforestry, and within those you can think of different subtypes. So there can be silvopasture, it can be projects that have more a conservation-oriented flavor, and then mangroves, of course. And then in terms of volume, we are looking for projects that can deliver at least 100,000 tons offer for the 10-year offtake period. Eligible methodologies are those that have been CCP approved by ICBCM, by standards that have been approved by ICBCM. We are requiring KML files that are very clear. So a KML file for the pilot area and a KML file for the proposed offtake area. The pilot is something that is critical, and the reason is because it allows us to perform diligence on something that is already a proof of concept. It has to be sufficiently large of an area that is representative of the project's complexity, so about 2% of total offtake area. And the larger the project, the more we want to see there. And then the basic documentation, which we'll navigate a little bit through, that includes a PDD, an implementation plan that includes reports about the pilots and learnings, and then a carbon and financial model. Symbiosis will accept mixed projects, as I was saying, different project types that can include both restoration and conservation and management activities. Next, please. Thank you. All right. In terms of RFP resources, these are going to be really important and your best friends as you navigate to the Symbiosis RFP. So the first one is the quality criteria, which you can find our recently updated version that applies for both terrestrial projects and for mangroves. You can find it in our website. And then the second one is our frequently asked questions, which also contains a lot of information that you probably can help you with different questions that you have as you start submitting. Thank you. Um, the Perhaps the most important resource that you are going to find that we published and we updated again this year, just as we did last year, is the readiness checklist. We hope that this will help you ensure that you have all the required documentation and understand what Symbiosis will be looking for in each of the documents as we assess these projects. Um, the checklist has two stages. I'm going to talk about this right now, but it really has it's much more detailed this time. It will be especially important for early stage developers to help them guide the evidence and documentation that we are going to be looking for. Next, please. All right, a couple more innovations that we have this year that you'll find as you progress in the RFP are going to be a carbon model cover sheet, which it basically will help us understand everything about your carbon modeling in a sort of like summarized view, which includes an overview of all the CRUs that are going to be generated, a lot of the implementation assumptions that you can see there. We will also be asking just very clearly and specifically for the different deductions and pools that are being included in the project. And then also about we are requiring the data on the carbon removal curves in a very simplified version that can allow us to see what are the expectations, what are the projections of growth for your different project activities. Next, please. And similarly, we have a financial model cover sheet, which it also helps us sort of like summarize and take like a quick glance at your financials, and that includes offtake and production of the CRUs that are being offered to Symbiosis, also a section about implementation, how it links to costs, annual cost by category, which includes different categories of costs. Revenue sharing, it's super important for us to evaluate, not just the financials of the project, investors economics, and then developer economics. So you can see there all the different sections that the cover sheet will contain. And we're really hoping that this is going to also standardize things and make it more clear for you about understanding what we are asking. Next, please. Okay, so I was talking about the developer checklist. As I mentioned earlier, it is going to be a key resource to help you navigate the RFP. I described the importance of meeting the eligibility requirements, and we hope that this checklist really could be the best tool for that. Um, we will dive into more details in a little bit, but I just wanted to highlight that you can see it will be divided. You'll find the documentation is aggregated into two main sections. One will take you from eligibility to screening, and another one will take you through intermediate diligence, and we will require different documentation for that. You will not need to submit the intermediate diligence documents until you reach the intermediate phase. So at that point, we will request additional information. Next, please. Thank you. All right. So, how to apply? Well, as I mentioned, we have partnered with Available to make the experience as smooth as possible, and we hope you'll enjoy that. So once you create your account, you'll see that as in the same way that I was representing in that diagram, the different stages of diligence, you will be able to progress through that. A reminder, just that moving through eligibility stage, if you're eligible there, is not an indication that your project will advance beyond screening stage. So that just puts you in the next phase. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about just how that looks like. Next, please. So as you start your application, you'll find in the tabs you have an overview section and then the submission section, which helps you sort of like manage your application. I just want to flag here, there are many features that are interesting here, but I want to flag just a couple of things. So as you are making progress, you will always find there are two important resources. One is that you will find frequently asked questions that is linked. It is mirroring the FAQs of our website. on the right-hand side there. And then you also have a chat feature that connects you to the available team. And depending on your question or issue, that can come to us. And then we do our best to review these communications as often as we can so that we can generate a prompt response to you. So just for you to understand that we're also there looking at what is happening. And then please also know that in the upper right hand, you can change language if that is something that you want. So you can find English, of course, and then Spanish, Portuguese, and French. So hopefully that can make things easier and you can toggle between those languages easily. Okay, next. Well, so now I'm going to pass it to the Silvestrum team, which has been a very helpful set of experts for us to help us develop the Mangrove RFP. And they will help us now navigate to some of the more meaty aspects of the checklist and the documentation guidance that we require. And the Silvestrum team is one of the full diligence providers that should you advance to full diligence, you may be matched with. So thank you in advance to them, and I hope this was helpful.
Thanks, Paulo. It's a real pleasure to be working with Symbiosis on this. If you can move to the next slide. So ahead of diving into the substance of what we're going to talk about today, I'll just very briefly introduce Silvestrum and some of the team that will be presenting. So Silvestrum, we're an independent advisory firm focused mainly on natural climate solutions, particularly blue carbon. Blue carbon's a broad subject, so our work is also broad. It spans from science to carbon accounting, policy regulation, and also supporting projects with on-the-ground implementation. And the team joining me today, reflects that kind of broad focus. So my name's Leah. I'm a principal here at Silvestrum, and my focus is mainly on the implementation of blue carbon projects, particularly from a governance and a carbon accounting perspective. Also joined by Adam, who comes with a background in agriculture and reforestation. And today he's going to be presenting on some of the overarching core components that Symbiosis will be assessing. We also have Cindy, who's a remote sensing expert, and she's going to be walking us through some of the pieces related to dynamic performance benchmarks and what this means in practice in a mangrove environment. Many of you will already know Steve. He, in addition to being one of the other principals at Silvestrum, he's a coastal wetland scientist who's been working on blue carbon pretty much since its inception a couple of decades ago. And Steve's going to be talking through the concept of allochthonous carbon, as well as sea level rise and what this means in tidal wetlands, in particular mangrove ecosystems. And last but absolutely not least, we have Raquel, who is a lawyer within our legal and policy team, and she's going to be talking about some of the governance components that Symbiosis will be looking through as they review projects and move through the due diligence process. So without further ado, Adam, I'll hand over to you.
Excellent. Hi, everyone. It is great to have everyone here. I'm going to provide some information on eligible methodologies for use in mangrove restoration projects and additional requirements and guidance for projects applying in the second RFP. So projects may use a number of methodologies from standards that have been approved by the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets. So these include Verra's VM33 and VM7, Gold Standard Sustainable Management of Mangroves Methodology, Isometrics Mangrove Restoration Protocol, and Climate Action Reserve's Mexico Forest Protocol. This list may be updated pending the latest assessment by the ICVCM. In particular, Plan Vivo is currently under review, which may permit the use of their PM1 and blue carbon methodology in the future, but these methodologies are not currently eligible. In addition to methodological requirements, projects must meet specific requirements set forth by Symbiosis under their quality criteria and readiness checklist documents that Paulo discussed earlier. These documents describe the fundamental requirements of high-quality blue carbon projects. These requirements are both broad, concerned with overarching principles for high-quality mangrove restoration projects, and in some cases, specific, detailing project-level technical requirements in their scope. So the high-quality blue carbon requirements, and is an excellent resource to read. The high quality blue carbon principles detailed in the practitioner's guide include safeguard nature, empower people, employ the best information, interventions, and carbon accounting practices, operate locally and contextually, and finally, mobilize high integrity capital. While all of these components of the HQBCs are crucial for a successful project, in evaluating projects, Symbiosis will be scrutinizing point three most closely. Employ the best information, interventions, and carbon accounting practices. So, specific requirements and guidelines provided within the quality criteria and readiness checklist do not specifically align with any one methodology. All right. Projects utilizing any given methodology will have to ensure that they meet Symbiosis's requirements in addition to those set forth in the individual standard and methodology. So some of these requirements include that only removals are considered. However, Symbiosis does ask that carbon models include both avoided emissions and removals, even though only removals are currently considered in any potential offtake agreement. Project design must also take into consideration conditions relevant to tidal ecosystems. This includes demonstration that impacts of a project on non-CO2 greenhouse gases like methane are de minimis, such as through salinity measurements, or accounted for clearly. Risk assessments must take into account sea level rise and tropical storms. Ecological leakage may not occur from projects' impact on hydrology, and soil organic carbon accumulation must be measured and monitored ex post, so not using a default factor. And monitoring and stratification should be based on an understanding of carbon stocks and sediment dynamics across the project area. This also includes a requirement that allochthonous SOC is accounted for and excluded from crediting. And lastly, similar to the first terrestrial RFP, mangrove projects in the second RFP require the use of a dynamic performance benchmark for assessing the crediting baseline. Cindy will be discussing more on this shortly. However, some mangrove-specific contextualization is important. There are two scenarios under which the dynamic baselines may not be required. One is in cases where ecological degradation and socioeconomic and institutional conditions are such that mangrove ecosystems are highly unlikely to regenerate or be restored without carbon finance, or biome-wide restoration projects where the scale of the project depletes the potential pool for control plots. In mangroves, the potential control plot donor pool area is often very spatially constrained and limited, and finding bioclimatically similar areas outside of the project area can be impossible in some scenarios. So flexibility has been considered for an exemption from dynamic baselines. However, projects with a dynamic performance benchmark will be viewed more favorably, and exceptions will be reviewed on a case-by-case basis for mangrove restoration projects. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. And to ensure appropriate project design and project activity that best addresses the drivers of degradation within the project area, the quality criteria outline a project activity selection process for selecting the most appropriate interventions to restore mangroves in these areas. So the project activity selection process follows 5 steps diagrammed on the flowchart shown here. So first, what is the distribution and composition of mangroves currently and historically within the project area? So project developers need to determine the species ecology of mangroves on site and the hydrological patterns that would typically control their distribution and establishment, and base species selection and intervention to reflect this. So this includes biophysical drivers such as elevation gradients, salinity regimes, and wave energy to determine which species naturally occur in each zone. Second is, what are the drivers of degradation? So project developers need to identify stressors and barriers currently preventing natural mangrove recovery. For step 3, if there's minimal degradation, projects should support natural regeneration by addressing any stressors that have contributed to degradation. If there is more substantial degradation, projects should implement assisted regeneration, starting with identifying obstacles to natural regeneration, including potential hydrological changes, so propagules can settle naturally and mangroves can grow without replanting. This may also include the use of supplementary planting when justified. such as to stabilize altered sediment topography or to reintroduce species to a site. And lastly, finally, if all of the above steps are not effective, projects should use direct interventions like i.e. planting mangroves as a last resort. And so this brings me to pilot, well, previous slide, please. Sorry. The establishment of pilot restoration plots are an important part of this process. So they serve as a trial run of restoration practices to verify that projects have correctly identified a viable restoration strategy for the bioclimatic and land use history conditions of the project area. They also serve as an invaluable educational opportunity to adapt restoration practices for application within the broader project area. So establishment of pilot restoration plots are therefore required by Symbiosis, along with an accompanying report. The idea is that project design, the restoration plan, and ex-ante assumptions incorporate the results and lessons learned from the pilot restoration project. And the choice of restoration approach should also be clearly articulated in line with the project activity selection process that I just discussed. This would also be a good moment to mention the Mangrove Restoration Tracker tool. It is an open access, standardized data platform designed to allow mangrove restoration practitioners to record, track, and monitor mangrove restoration projects across their full life cycle. So from baseline conditions through interventions and post-restoration monitoring. It's built directly into the Global Mangrove Watch platform, ensuring spatial consistency with globally recognized mangrove extent datasets. It's a lightweight and robust monitoring and reporting backbone for restoration projects, enabling consistent documentation, cross-project learning, and evidence-based improvement of restoration practice at both site-specific and global scales. It's an invaluable tool to start utilizing while determining baseline conditions and monitoring pilot restoration activities. So projects utilizing the Mangrove Restoration Tracker tool will be viewed favorably by Symbiosis. So I'd like to thank everyone really, really much for attending and listening. I'm going to hand it over to Cindy now to discuss more on dynamic performance benchmarks.
Thanks, Adam. So as part of Symbiosis quality criterion on methodology and baseline selection, projects must use a dynamic performance benchmark, which uses control plots that are statistically matched to project plots to represent how mangrove cover and carbon stocks would naturally evolve in the absence of a project. So by using the observations in the matched controls, dynamic baselines are able to reflect changes, for example, in market trends, policies, or environmental changes that can affect counterfactual carbon sequestration and which would be very difficult to capture in static approaches. So in mangroves, this comparison is usually based on a proxy for biomass carbon stock, which is usually a remote sensing index, such as the normalized difference vegetation index or canopy height. The choice of proxy or metric should be derived from satellite imagery that is cloud-free, does not capture seasonality, and more importantly, demonstrate good correlation with biomass carbon stock in mangroves. So what we're looking for is whether the project plots show higher carbon sequestration trajectories than comparable control plots. So here we have an example of what that would look like for a project. In the first image, you have identified your control area, also termed the donor pool area, which I will talk about shortly, and defined your control plots. Based on the proxy of choice, that is the remote sensing index, as you can see in the second image, you determine the carbon sequestration in both your project and control plots over time. Based on the dynamic performance benchmark, when the carbon sequestration curve of the project plots exceeds that of the control plots, we can then be confident that this additional sequestration is attributed to the carbon project itself. For example, if we look at the graph on the right, let's say you have a degraded parcel, 100% of which was reforested as part of a carbon project. With the dynamic performance benchmark, what you may find out is that the project may in fact only contribute to 80% of the carbon sequestration in that parcel, given that the remaining 20% would have been sequestered through vegetation growth, even in the absence of the project. So the takeaway here is that the dynamic baseline equals a more realistic representation of counterfactual baseline carbon sequestration, And the performance benchmark equals the apples-to-apples comparison of whether the project is outperforming what would have happened in its absence. Now that the concept is clear, the key question becomes how do we find the control plots that truly match the project plots? Next slide, please. So to ensure that the matched controls are optimally chosen and truly comparable to your project plots, the first step is to define what we call the donor pool area, which closely matches your project conditions. The first criterion is that the sourcing area, the donor pool area, should be selected within national boundaries and within the same land use type. There's no fixed size requirement for your donor pool area, but it needs to be sufficiently large to identify the number of control plots that are required to match the number of project plots. The second one is that your defined area must sit within the same biome level ecoregion as your project. This helps ensure comparable vegetation communities, species composition, elevation profile, and bioclimatic variables, all of which strongly influence mangrove dynamics. Third, we have policy, regulations, land tenure, and governance. Even if two areas look similar ecologically, different governance can change outcomes through enforcement, access, and land management. So control areas must fall under comparable governance and tenure regimes to the project area. This means similar regulations, land tenure classifications, and management context. And finally, any areas already registered under other carbon offset programs or under protected status need to be excluded from your donor pool area to avoid contamination of your baseline with intervention-driven outcomes. So together, these criteria help ensure that the control plots are carefully filtered to be as representative as possible of the project area, providing a credible representation of what would have happened in the absence of your project. Next slide, please. So through the symbiosis quality criteria and signals from other buyers and investors, it is clear that the market is increasingly requiring projects to use dynamic rather than static counterfactual baselines. So any project that is in a position to implement this approach is strongly encouraged to do so. However, it is recognized that in some situations, certain challenges may make it impossible for a project to model their baseline dynamically. And what we're going to talk about is some of those considerations. So first, we know that fragmentation is a known challenge in mangroves. So mangrove ecosystems are often highly patchy. They're shaped by tides and sedimentation or localized disturbance. Such a complex and dynamic environment is illustrated, for example, in the image on the right. So this makes it more difficult to identify large continuous areas that behave uniformly over time. Finding donor pool areas for control plots that genuinely match site conditions across all relevant strata, including elevation, salinity, hydrology, and species composition, is inherently difficult. So what this means in practice is that developers should expect to rely on stratification and sufficient replication of control plots to better capture the natural variability across the landscape. A second challenge is the limited availability of suitable donor pool areas, particularly for biome-wide projects like Adam has touched upon earlier. So mangrove systems are often spatially constrained, and once you apply all of the matching criteria, for example, the ecoregion, the tidal regime, or even the exclusion of other carbon projects, the pool of eligible donor areas can become quite small. This is why early exploration of control plot feasibility is critical during the project design. There are also other unique considerations related to dynamic baseline in mangrove systems. One of them being that during a crediting period, your control plots may be lost due to, let's say, sea level rise, major storms, land use change, or the establishment of new carbon projects. So projects need to anticipate this risk and think about adaptive monitoring strategies. Finally, there are limitations related to the performance of the remote sensing indices in mangroves. We've tested several indices that are commonly used in terrestrial forest systems. In mangroves, these indices tend to perform moderately well, but not perfectly. And this is expected given the dynamic nature of tidal ecosystems, its frequent inundation, and the mixed vegetation structure. So for that reason, there is no single preferred index. Developers should select an index or a combination of indices that best fits their site conditions and clearly justify that choice. Different indices may perform better in different mangrove environments depending on canopy density, fragmentation, and hydrological context. And that's fine as long as you justify your choice and the same metric is used consistently across project and control plots over time. So given these considerations and the recognition that certain challenges may arise, like Adam mentioned before, Symbiosis will evaluate whether a project qualifies for an exemption from the dynamic performance benchmark or the dynamic baseline on a case-by-case basis. And I will pass it over to Steve.
Hi, everybody. Pardon me. I'm going to run through a couple of some of the trickier aspects of dealing with coastal wetlands, that of allochthonous carbon, and also how to think about sea level rise and sedimentation. Allochthonous carbon. So what is that? That's carbon that's been sequestered from the atmosphere outside the project boundary and brought into the site and then accumulated along with autochthonous carbon, which is carbon directly removed from the atmosphere on site. Now, projects must appropriately deduct the contribution of allochthonous carbon from the greenhouse gas accounting. Projects should collect field measurements, field sediments, samples to a minimum depth determined by taking a time marker, such as a feldspar marker, to measure and then measure the carbon content within the atmosphere, within the sample. Now, let's clarify an important point. You know, when a revegetation project takes place, you're probably starting with a denuded site. It's been a site that's been cleared, it may have been scraped, created a shrimp pond, and so you have very little vegetation on the site itself. When you bring back the vegetation, the mangrove vegetation, two things happen. One, you get direct infusion of carbon from the root material as the trees grow. Now, within that depth horizon, all of that carbon is autochthonous, and there's no need to do a deduction for allochthonous carbon. But at the surface, you get accumulation of muds and organic material from outside of the site. At that point on the surface material, you need to deduct the allochthonous carbon from that portion of the depth that has been accumulated through the duration of the project. In low sedimentation areas and very organic systems with low sediment availability, all of the carbon or much of the carbon will be autochthonous. But in high sedimentation areas, such as shrimp ponds, which are filling in with sediment, a lot of that carbon will be from outside of the site and will need to be deducted as part of the accounting. So soil carbon accumulation and or loss rates should directly measure on an ex post basis and based upon scientifically robust understanding of the carbon stocks and sediment dynamics across the entire project area on an ex ante basis. Calculation should account for the additional soil carbon accumulation and or losses attributable to the project activities relative to the baseline scenario, which may, for example, include existing but degraded mangrove cover. Next slide, please. Now, sea level rise is another challenging aspect of a project. Mangrove restoration projects should explicitly include identification of sea level rise risk. Projects accurately evaluate the threat of sea level rise by modeling sediment dynamics and local geological processes with local or regional data using highly shared socioeconomic pathways for sea level rise. Effectively, you've got to use the high IPCC scenario for your sea level rise assessment. Now, when you look at a topography like this, three things are happening on your site. One, if sediment's available, which is the case in most systems, but not all, your mangrove will be building through time as sea level rises. However, also at the seaward margin of the site, you will have erosion events taking place. And some of the carbon that has been accumulated will wash away and be deposited in the near shore somewhere else, much of that going back to the atmosphere. At the landward end of the site, you're going to have migration upslope, and newer carbon will accumulate there. So effectively, over the lifetime of the project, you have to create a mass balance approach where you factor in the building of the sediment, erosion, and accretion at the far end. Now, in a system with good topography, a gradual slope, then everything will move landwards and it will not be sensitive to sediment supply. But in systems which do not have a good slope, then you have to look for locations with a good sediment supply to maintain that resilience to sea level rise. And I'll come to this in the next slide. So projects apply a risk assessment mechanism developed by standard bodies to evaluate the reversal risks. Tools such as the Climate Smart Mangrove tool can be helpful to identify how projects is structured to mitigate risk. Standout projects will demonstrate that project geomorphic setting is optimal for durability, as just mentioned. For mangrove projects, the potential impact of sea level rise on the project carbon counting must, at a minimum, be included in the risk assessment. Projects located in high in the tidal range or in macrotidal systems, those with a tidal range of more than 4 meters, will be deemed at low risk due to sea level rise impacts. There are various tools and guidance documents that can support the assessment of risk posed by sea level rise on carbon stocks. These include the VCS guidance document related to the assessment of sea level rise in the context of the VCS AFOLU non-permanence risk assessment, the IPCC AR6 sea level rise projection tool, an interactive tool that provides IPCC 6th assessment sea level rise risk projections under multiple emission scenarios, global and regional. The Delta DTM. DTM is very important when you're developing these projections. The Delta DTM product, a freely available global digital terrain model, specifically designed for low elevation coastal areas, providing elevation data below 10 meters above sea level where mangroves occur. And also the World Wildlife Fund Climate Smart Mangrove tool, helpful in identifying how to structure a project to mitigate climate risks to sea level rise. Next slide, please. Now, a little bit on the sensitivity of these projects to sediment supply, so you can factor in your thinking about location and geomorphic setting. Now, what does this graph show? In the elevation feet, apologies that the units are in imperial, but the blue line reflects sea level rise from a marsh plain that is at balance with sea level, effectively a high marsh. So this is the IPCC 8.5 scenario, and we have around about 90 centimeters of sea level rise over the 100-year time frame. The green lines reflect a restoration project for a subsided site that is about 60 centimeters below the elevation at which a marsh or mangrove would build to. Now, sediment supply is very important. When you have a high sediment supply that you might find in a deltaic or an estuarine setting, here in units of 300 milligrams per liter or higher, the system will quickly build back up to the mangrove elevation plane, and even through the high rate of sea level rise will continue to accumulate through time and match the rate of sea level rise. You still have to factor in erosion at the seaward edge. So areas like the Guyana Shelf, for example, the Amazon, is an excellent example where such projects would be very resilient. As your amount of sediment availability diminishes, say half of that to 150 milligrams per liter, then you start to fall. But you may still track rate of sea level rise and still remain in the vegetation zone of the mangrove. But as the sediment supply falls further down to 50 milligrams per liter, as you might find in relatively clear water systems and estuaries around islands, your sediment availability may be very low and will never attain the elevation that will keep pace with sea level rise into the future. Under such situation,
All right, I think Steve froze. Is he frozen for anyone else?
Yes,
sorry,
I
got
think he
disconnected.
has.
Oh, there we go.
Pass on
He's
to Raquel.
back. We're back. Awesome.
Yay.
Sorry about that. Pass
No
on to
worries.
Raquel.
Go ahead, Steve.
Passing on to Raquel. Thank you very much.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. So yeah, to finalize our presentation, I'm going to speak a little bit. Oh, and can you move the slide just a second? Yeah, so I'm going to speak a little bit about the governance aspects of a project, which are, like very critical, especially for mangroves. They are an important part of project development in the sense that, mangroves, they are often located in a complex contextual situation where you have multiple authorities, you have jurisdictions overlapping, both at the landward levels to the forestry agencies and regulations, but also to the sea awards level, to the fishery and agencies and regulations. And on top of all of this, you also have a strong dependency from local communities and in using these resources, right? So we separated the entire governance criteria on the checklist in three key steps. The first one is mapping stakeholders, which is basically trying to understand who matters in the project, who decides, and trying to map all the stakeholders that are there. So often that means communities, particularly indigenous communities groups, but also local communities, government agencies, fisheries, and so on. And trying to clarify the user rights that are there and the tenure that exists. A key principle for this is to basically recognize and respect local and indigenous rights from the outset. And this includes trying to document tenure clearly, ensure the free, prior, and informed consent, ensure that social and environmental safeguards are in place. And obviously, a lot of this also speaks back to the standard requirements, both the standard that you may choose, but also at a high level to the climate, community, and biodiversity standard from Vera, and also SDG stuff for sustainable development benefits that you may want to claim with your project. Another thing that is important is to establish proper tools for engagement with communities, and that means throughout the entire design, through implementation, and even further along with grievance mechanisms and so on, and to ensure that that is a formal land access for the project proponent. And that particularly refers back to statutory instruments, particularly for mangroves, which are located in public lands, such as those located in protected areas, but also beyond to private lands, community lands. You need an avenue to engage these communities into account for the tenure aspects, and that may mean a public-private partnership agreement, concession, or so on. You also need to look at applicable governance regimes that there is, particularly with the carbon market regulations being launched. A lot of countries, as you all know, are starting to launch requirements, permitting requirements, and also government approvals that you may need to follow. So you need to understand what in the regulatory aspects apply. And step two basically links this whole idea to the theory of change or the project impact theory, which means properly articulate the drivers of change and what you actually want to achieve, what is the issue that you're going to achieve and how you're going to do that, what are the benefits that you are claiming, so climate mitigation, biodiversity protection, community livelihoods, you name it, and explain the how and why, so to the theory of change. So the PDD on the checklist asks for you to create a project impact theory. And this whole thing is also linked to the MRV in the end, which is step 3. So MRV is basically connecting measurement, accountability, and transparency, to create long-term benefits for the project and for the communities. Ideally, you want to measure not just the carbon benefits, but also the co-benefits, and try to link that with KPIs, with key performance indicators, and link that to actually measuring and sharing these benefits further on through a benefit sharing plan. So the two key aspects, it is that you need a stakeholder engagement plan, you need a benefit sharing plan, you also need an MRV plan that connects all of these ideas to the theory of change and so on. So in summary, basically governance is about bringing legitimacy to the project, bringing social integrity, and making sure that everything that you do is legally sound, is, that is a community buy-in. So you make sure that this is going to last throughout the entire process. And with that, I finalize my presentation on this slide and pass back to Julia. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone, and Silvestrum team. Wow, what great content and depth of content. Thank you so much for going through that. We now have about 3 minutes left. We've answered 16 questions so far in the Q&A. If you have any other questions, please drop them there, or feel free to raise your hand. We can try to unmute you to answer any questions. But we'll just give a bit more time to answer questions that people have. And again, if you have project-specific questions, I know we've received some that are really specific to a given project. Please reach out to rfp@symbiosiscoalition.org to ask those particular questions. We have a question here on indication of the latest news from Mangroves and whether this affects Symbiosis Coalition anyway. I don't know what news from Mangroves mean. We're still doing our RFP, still focused on, okay, Microsoft, someone clarified. We're still focused on our RFP, moving this RFP forward. So we're continuing to move that forward and advance our RFP, building more members and our coalition efforts. All right. Any other questions? I want to thank our speakers, so Paulo and then Ellie, who's been answering all the questions in chat. Thank you so much. And I'll unspotlight myself so you guys can see everybody. Here we go. Thank you so much to the Silvestrum team for all the effort. We're really excited to see the projects come through. We know that there's amazing work going on around the world, and we can't wait to see the projects that you're working on. Again, please don't be shy to email questions, although please do take a look at the FAQs first, because your questions may have already been answered, and we'll be posting this webinar with the slides on our website. So thank you very much. Wait, I have one more question. Or yeah, we'll answer this question. I think we already answered about the dynamic baseline, but we'll make sure to share that more in questions in our frequently asked questions to make sure people know what we're looking for. Thank you, everyone. All right. See you. Bye.